Jesus often taught using stories, not speeches, not arguments, but stories drawn from ordinary life. He spoke about fields and homes, about money and work, about family and responsibility. These stories were easy to remember, but they were not always easy to understand. That was intentional. Parables invite the listener to slow down. They do not rush toward conclusions. They allow meaning to unfold gradually, often revealing more over time than at first hearing. In these moments of quiet listening, the parables of Jesus can be heard not as lessons to master, but as reflections to rest within. One of the simplest parables Jesus shared was about two builders. Both builders heard the same words. Both had access to the same knowledge, and both desired a stable home. The difference was not intention, it was foundation. One builder chose to take time, to prepare carefully, and to build on solid ground. The other chose speed. The surface looked fine, and the work was easier. For a while, the two homes appeared the same. There was no visible difference, no immediate consequence. But when difficulty came, when pressure arrived, the difference became clear. One structure remained, the other did not. This parable is not about construction. It is about what holds when life presses. Jesus used this story to show that understanding something is not the same as living it. Stability is revealed over time, not in comfort, but in challenge. Another story Jesus told focused on invitation. He described a great banquet, carefully prepared, with everything made ready. The invitation went out. Nothing more was required but a response. Yet many who were invited began to delay. Some were busy, some were distracted, some believed the invitation would remain open. It was not rejection through anger, but neglect through indifference. So the invitation widened. Those who were overlooked were welcomed. Those who did not expect inclusion were brought in. The story quietly reveals something important. Availability is not the same as readiness. Hearing an invitation does not mean accepting it, and being near something meaningful does not guarantee engagement. Jesus often spoke about value in ways that reversed expectation. He described a stone that builders examined carefully, then set aside. It did not appear strong enough, it did not seem essential, so it was rejected. But over time, that same stone became foundational. What was dismissed became central. Through this story, Jesus pointed out something subtle. Value is not always obvious. Importance is not always recognized immediately. What is overlooked may be precisely what sustains everything else. Some parables focused on wealth, not as a condemnation, but as a mirror. Jesus described a man whose fields produced abundantly. He planned carefully. He stored generously. He felt secure. Yet his sense of security was built entirely on what he possessed. The story ends quietly, without spectacle. It leaves the listener with a single reflection. Preparation that does not consider meaning is incomplete. Abundance does not automatically equal stability, and accumulation does not guarantee peace. Jesus also told stories about forgiveness. In one parable, two people owed debts. Neither could repay. Both were released. The question was not who owed more, but who understood mercy. Forgiveness was not presented as a transaction, but as a transformation. When mercy is received deeply, it changes how one responds to others. When it is received lightly, it passes through without effect. Throughout these stories, a pattern begins to form. The parables of Jesus do not divide people into categories. They invite reflection, rather than judgment. They ask not, "Who is right?" but what endures. In quiet listening, these stories continue working, not through urgency, but through presence. And as the words settle, they create space. Space for consideration, space for rest, space to remain.
Many of the stories
with
Jesus
what
told
matters were meant to challenge assumptions quietly, not loudly. They often sounded simple at first, almost familiar, yet they carried depth beneath the surface. One such story focused on wealth and the idea of security. Jesus described a man whose land produced more than expected. His plans seemed reasonable. He expanded his storage. He prepared for the future. He felt confident in what he had built. But his sense of peace rested entirely on what he owned. The parable does not criticize planning. It questions where trust is placed. Security that depends only on abundance is fragile. Meaning is not created by accumulation, and peace does not come automatically with preparation. This story leaves space for reflection, asking quietly what truly sustains a life over time. Jesus also told stories about forgiveness in ways that exposed contrast rather than conflict. In one parable, two people owed debts. The difference between them was not character, but scale. One debt was small, the other was overwhelming. Neither could repay. Both were released. The story pauses here, inviting a question without asking it directly. Gratitude is revealed in how mercy is understood. Forgiveness that is received deeply reshapes the heart. Forgiveness received lightly often leaves everything unchanged. Jesus used this contrast to show that awareness can transform response. Another parable Jesus shared centered on invitation. A great event was prepared, everything was ready, nothing more was needed. Yet, many who were invited postponed their response. Not out of anger, but distraction. Daily responsibilities took priority, attention shifted elsewhere. The invitation remained real, but the response faded. So the invitation widened. Those who did not expect inclusion found themselves welcomed. The story gently reveals that opportunity can exist without engagement. Presence is not the same as participation, and proximity does not guarantee acceptance. Some parables focused on judgment, not as condemnation, but as clarity. Jesus spoke of a narrow entrance, not hidden, but specific. Many approached it casually, assuming time would always remain. The story does not create fear. It introduces urgency without force. It reminds the listener that direction matters and timing has significance. Choices made gradually still lead somewhere. Paths are formed quietly, long before outcomes are visible. Throughout these stories, a consistent rhythm emerges. The parables do not rush. They do not demand immediate answers. They are meant to remain with the listener, settling gently, returning in quiet moments. Jesus used ordinary images to speak about lasting things, not to overwhelm, but to invite awareness. As these stories continue, their power lies not in explanation, but in reflection. And in that reflection, space is created. Space to listen, space to consider,
Jesus often
space
told stories
to rest that revealed more through contrast than explanation. Rather than telling people what to think, he showed them how different responses lead to different outcomes. One story focused on prayer. Two people approached it in very different ways. One felt confident, certain of his standing, comforted by comparison. The other approached quietly, aware of his shortcomings, uncertain but honest. The story does not elevate failure, It highlights humility. Jesus used this contrast to show that awareness matters more than presentation. Approach shapes outcome, and openness creates space for growth. Another parable focused on compassion, not as a concept, but as action. A man was harmed and left vulnerable. Others passed by, not because they were cruel, but because they were occupied. Responsibility felt distant. Inconvenience felt immediate. Then someone unexpected stopped. Help was offered without calculation. Time was given without guarantee. Jesus used this story to redefine closeness. Compassion was not based on proximity or identity, but on willingness. Attention became the dividing line. Jesus also spoke about return, about leaving, losing direction, and coming back changed. In one story, a person walked away seeking independence. At first, freedom felt expansive, but over time, resources diminished and clarity faded. Eventually, the journey turned inward. The decision to return was not driven by certainty, but by humility. The welcome that followed was not measured or reserved. It was immediate. Jesus told this story to show that restoration does not begin with perfection, but with recognition. Some stories addressed rejection without bitterness. Jesus spoke of something examined, judged insufficient, and set aside. Yet what was dismissed became essential. The story challenges surface judgment. What appears unfit may be foundational. What is overlooked may hold weight unseen. The parable invites patience with what is not immediately understood. As these stories are heard together, a quiet pattern becomes clear. Change is not sudden. Understanding is not forced. Movement happens gradually, through listening, through reflection, through attention. Jesus told parables not to overwhelm, but to remain. They linger, returning in still moments, and in their quiet repetition, they continue working, creating space, softening resistance, allowing meaning to unfold with time. Many of the stories Jesus told centered on decisions that appeared small at first. Not dramatic turning points, but quiet choices made over time. One parable described two paths. Both were open, both were visible. One felt easy, spacious, comfortable. The other felt limited, narrow, intentional. Nothing forced a decision, but direction mattered. Jesus used this image to show that outcomes are shaped long before they arrive, not by single moments, but by repeated steps. What feels effortless now may lead far from what lasts. And what requires care often leads somewhere stable. Another story focused on patience. A farmer scattered seed across different ground. Some soil received it quickly, but could not sustain it. Some allowed growth until pressure came. Some were crowded by competing concerns. Only one environment allowed the seed to remain. Jesus did not condemn the soil. He described it. Attention, protection, and consistency made the difference. The parable speaks gently about readiness. Not everyone receives at the same pace, and growth requires space. Jesus also spoke about responsibility in small measures. He described servants entrusted with varying amounts. Each received something. Each was expected to respond. The story did not compare amounts, it compared faithfulness. What was done with what was given mattered more than how much was received. The parable quietly affirms that usefulness is not limited by scale. Consistency carries weight. Taken together, these stories reinforce a quiet truth. Lasting change rarely arrives suddenly. It forms through steady direction, patient care, and faithful attention. Jesus did not present these ideas as pressure. He presented them as insight. Insight meant to remain with the listener, not demanding response, but inviting awareness. And as awareness settles, it shapes movement. Slowly, naturally, over time. Jesus often used stories to reveal how people relate to one another, not through rules, but through response. One parable described a situation of mercy. Someone was released from an obligation they could never fulfill. The weight was removed completely. Freedom was given without condition. Yet afterward, that same person refused compassion to someone else. The contrast was quiet, but unmistakable. The story does not shame forgiveness. It shows what happens when mercy is not allowed to change the one who receives it. Jesus used this parable to suggest that grace is meant to move outward. When it stops within a person, it hardens rather than heals. Another story focused on attention. A shepherd noticed that something small was missing. Not a large loss, not something obvious, yet it mattered. The search was deliberate. Care was shown for what could easily be dismissed. Jesus told this story to show that value is not determined by scale. What seems minor is still worth seeking. Presence itself is an expression of care. Jesus also spoke about waiting, about readiness. In one parable, some were prepared for what was coming. Others assumed they would have more time. Nothing separated them at first, but when the moment arrived, only some were ready to respond. The story does not punish delay. It reveals consequence. Readiness is not urgency. It is awareness over time. As these stories are heard together, they point gently toward a shared idea. Meaning is not found in extremes. It forms through steady awareness, through quiet responsibility, through attention that remains. Jesus told parables not to complicate understanding, but to slow it down. And in that slower space, clarity becomes possible. Jesus often allowed his stories to move slowly, not because the ideas were simple, but because understanding takes time when it is meant to last. Many of the parables do not announce their purpose. They unfold quietly, revealing meaning only as attention remains. One such story focused on growth. Jesus described seed scattered widely, not carefully placed, not selectively chosen, simply released. Some fell where conditions were shallow. Growth appeared quickly, but endurance was limited. Some fell where pressure was subtle, crowded not by opposition, but by distraction. Some fell where space was protected, where depth allowed roots to form. The parable does not assign blame, it observes outcome. Growth depended not on the seed, but on environment. Jesus used this story to suggest that transformation requires conditions that are often cultivated quietly. Depth is not dramatic, it is patient. Another parable described labor. Workers were invited at different times. Some worked long hours, some worked briefly. At the end of the day, all were treated with equal generosity. The story unsettles expectation. It challenges the idea that value is earned strictly through duration. Jesus did not use this parable to dismiss effort. He used it to expose comparison. Comparison turns generosity into offense. Gratitude fades when fairness becomes the focus. The parable gently reminds the listener that mercy is not measured by symmetry. Jesus also told a story about something small that quietly transformed everything around it. A small amount introduced into something larger, not overpowering, not immediate, but persistent. Over time, change became complete. The parable speaks without urgency. It suggests that influence does not announce itself. It works steadily. Transformation often happens unnoticed until it is undeniable. Some parables addressed awareness. Jesus described people engaged in ordinary activity, eating, working, planning. Nothing appeared unusual, yet something decisive occurred. Some noticed, some did not. The story does not criticize ordinary life. It shows how attention determines readiness. Unawareness is not rebellion. It is distraction, extended over time. Jesus also spoke about value hidden from casual observation. Something overlooked, something buried, something found unexpectedly. When discovered, it changed everything. The finder did not hesitate. The parable emphasizes recognition. Seeing something clearly changes response instantly. Jesus used this story to show that insight often arrives suddenly, after long periods of quiet searching. As these stories remain together, a consistent truth becomes visible. Nothing important is rushed. Nothing lasting is forced. The parables teach through accumulation, through repetition, through familiarity. They are meant to be heard not once, but many times. Each listening reveals something new because the listener has changed. Jesus told these stories to remain present over time, to accompany daily life, to return in quiet moments. And in that returning, understanding grows. Not through pressure, not through urgency, but through staying. Jesus often returned to the same ideas, not because people failed to hear them, but because meaning deepens with familiarity. The parables were never meant to be consumed quickly. They were meant to stay nearby, returning to the listener over time. Many of these stories focus on small beginnings, quiet starts, ordinary moments that slowly shape direction. Jesus described something planted, not noticed at first, yet steadily growing. The process was gradual, almost invisible day to day. But over time, change became undeniable. The parable does not celebrate speed. It highlights patience. Growth that lasts rarely announces itself. Another story focused on preparation, not urgency, but readiness. Jesus described people living ordinary lives, working, planning, enjoying routine. Nothing felt unusual, yet something decisive arrived. Some were prepared, others were not. The difference was not intelligence or morality, it was attention. Readiness formed quietly over time, through awareness rather than anxiety. The parable suggests that what feels uneventful often carries the greatest weight. Jesus also told stories about trust. One parable described individuals entrusted with responsibility. Each was given something meaningful, not identical, but sufficient. What mattered was not the amount received, but the response to it. Some acted with care and consistency, others hesitated. Fear did not come from opposition, it came from uncertainty. The story does not condemn caution, it exposes paralysis. Faithfulness is not dramatic, it is steady. It moves forward even when outcomes are unclear. Several parables address perception. Jesus described people who observed events without recognizing significance. They were present, but unaware, not resistant, just distracted. Life continued normally, and because it felt normal, attention drifted. The stories do not criticize activity, they reveal how easily awareness fades. When attention weakens, discernment follows. Jesus also spoke about value hidden beneath appearance, something dismissed, something overlooked, something judged insufficient. Yet when examined closely, it proved essential. The parable challenges surface assessment. What appears weak may carry weight unseen, and what seems ordinary may support far more than expected. Value often reveals itself slowly after patience replaces assumption. Another story described effort that felt unequal. Some worked long hours, others arrived late. At the end, generosity was extended evenly. The parable unsettles comparison. It does not undermine work, it undermines entitlement. When generosity is measured against others, gratitude erodes. The story gently reminds the listener that mercy cannot be earned by outperforming someone else. Jesus often returned to the idea of direction. Paths formed gradually. Choices repeated quietly shaped outcomes long before consequences appeared. Nothing sudden occurred, no dramatic turning point, just steady movement in one direction or another. The parables reveal that life is rarely decided by single moments. It is shaped by patterns. Taken together, these stories form a rhythm, not instruction layered upon instruction, but reflection layered upon reflection. Jesus did not overwhelm his listeners. He invited them to stay, to listen again, to notice differently. Meaning unfolded as attention remained. The parables continue working long after the words end. They surface during rest, during quiet tasks, during stillness. They are not resolved quickly, they are lived with, and over time they shape direction without force, without urgency, without noise. Jesus often spoke in ways that allowed people to remain where they were. He did not force decisions, he did not rush understanding. Instead, he used stories that stayed with the listener, working quietly beneath the surface. Many of these parables revolve around awareness, not sudden change, but gradual realization. Jesus described people who were close to something meaningful without recognizing its significance. They heard, they observed, they participated, yet their attention was divided. The parable does not condemn them, it simply reveals what happens when awareness fades slowly. Meaning is rarely lost all at once. It slips away through distraction. One story described a lamp, not hidden deliberately, but placed where it could give light. The image is simple. Light does not need to announce itself. It simply reveals what is already present. Jesus used this story to show that understanding carries responsibility. What is seen cannot be unseen. And awareness, once gained, reshapes how everything else is viewed. Another parable focused on measurement, not scale, but intention. The same measure used outwardly returns inwardly. The story is quiet, almost unnoticed, yet it carries depth. Jesus was not warning against discernment. He was highlighting how perspective forms habit. How often we notice fault shapes how we experience mercy. Jesus also spoke about persistence. A person asked repeatedly, not because they doubted, but because they believed attention mattered. The parable does not praise demand. It illustrates trust. Consistency revealed confidence. The story suggests that persistence is not noise, but commitment expressed over time. Some parables addressed delay. Seeds planted do not emerge immediately. Growth happens unseen. Days pass without evidence, yet beneath the surface, change is occurring. Jesus used this image to reassure those discouraged by stillness. Silence does not equal failure. Waiting is not inactivity. Jesus also told stories about separation that happens quietly, not dramatic judgment, but natural distinction. Things placed side by side eventually reveal difference. Time becomes the filter. The parable does not threaten, it clarifies. What remains and what fades often does so gradually. Across these stories, a shared pattern continues. Nothing important is rushed. Nothing lasting is loud. The parables invite the listener to stay present without pressure, to notice without anxiety, to allow meaning to surface naturally. Jesus did not teach to overwhelm attention. He taught to cultivate it. As these stories are heard together, they begin to overlap. Themes repeat, images return, not because progress has stopped, but because understanding deepens through familiarity. The parables were meant to be revisited, heard again in different moments, understood differently as life changes. In this quiet repetition, something happens. Resistance softens. Focus steadies. The stories do their work without demanding anything in return. And over time, they shape perspective, not through force, but through staying. Many of the stories Jesus told were not meant to be impressive. They were meant to be familiar. He spoke about moments people already understood, situations they had already seen, decisions they had already faced. In doing so, the parables did not pull listeners away from life. They returned them to it. One parable described a moment of discovery. Someone came across something valuable in an unexpected place. It was not found through searching with certainty, but through ordinary movement. When the value was recognized, everything else was rearranged. The parable does not dwell on sacrifice. It emphasizes clarity. Once something is truly seen, response becomes simple. Not easy, but clear. Jesus used this story to show that recognition changes priority. When meaning becomes visible, lesser attachments lose their grip. Another parable described loss. Something small went missing, not essential for survival, not devastating in scale, yet it mattered. The search was careful and deliberate. Attention was given fully until what was lost was found. The story does not exaggerate urgency, it shows care. Jesus used this parable to highlight attentiveness. What is valued receives focus, and what receives focus is rarely lost permanently. Jesus also told stories about contrast in response. Two people experienced the same moment, heard the same words, stood in the same place. Yet their reactions diverged. One internalized what was heard. The other allowed it to pass through without effect. The parable does not accuse, it observes. Response shapes outcome, and outcome reveals what has been held within. Several parables return to the idea of patience. Jesus described growth that could not be hurried. Days passed, nights came and went. Nothing appeared to change. Yet beneath the surface, progress continued. The story reassures those unsettled by silence. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Waiting often carries meaning that action cannot replace. Jesus also spoke about attention in a crowded world. Concerns overlap. Responsibilities accumulate. None are wrong, but together they can crowd what matters most. The parables do not dismiss responsibility. They warn of saturation. When everything is given equal weight, clarity suffers. Focus requires choice, and choice requires awareness. One story described division that was not imposed, but revealed. Things grew together for a long time. Only later did difference become obvious. The parable does not promote separation. It explains it. Time reveals nature. What is genuine remains. What is shallow fades. This is not threat, it is observation. As these stories continue to layer, a tone emerges. Gentle, unforced, consistent. Jesus did not rush listeners toward conclusions. He trusted time. He trusted repetition. He trusted that awareness would form naturally through quiet exposure. The parables invite a different kind of listening, not anxious, not analytical, but present. They allow the listener to remain at ease, even as meaning settles. Understanding grows not through pressure, but through staying, and in staying, direction forms. Slowly, reliably, without noise. Many of the stories Jesus shared centered on trust. Not trust expressed loudly, but trust revealed through choice. He spoke about people placed in situations where outcomes were uncertain. Nothing dramatic was demanded, no sudden test appeared. Instead, time passed. And what mattered most was what remained consistent when attention drifted elsewhere. One parable describes stewardship. Something was given into care, not ownership. It was meant to be used thoughtfully, not hidden, not neglected. The story does not glorify success. It highlights responsibility. What is entrusted is meant to move, to serve a purpose beyond itself. Jesus used this story to suggest that value grows when it is engaged, not merely preserved. Fear protects nothing. Attention allows growth. Another story focused on perception. A situation unfolded gradually. At first, everything looked acceptable. Nothing seemed urgent. Only over time did difference emerge. The parable does not condemn delay. It shows what delay reveals. Clarity often comes later than we expect, and by the time it arrives, direction has already formed. Jesus also spoke of contrast between appearance and substance. He described something that seemed impressive outwardly, but lacked depth. It was admired from a distance, but unreliable when depended upon. The story quietly challenges surface judgment. Not everything stable-looking is strong, and not everything humble is weak. Strength often hides quietly where patience allows it to grow. Some parables return to the idea of care. A person notices what others overlook, not because it is large, but because it is vulnerable. Care is shown without expectation of return. The story does not elevate heroism, it highlights awareness. Attention becomes compassion when it leads to action, and action reveals what truly matters. Jesus also described moments when opportunity passed unnoticed. Nothing closed abruptly, nothing ended loudly. The chance simply moved on. The parable is not harsh, it is honest. Awareness delayed too long often feels like regret later. Readiness is not anxiety, it is presence practiced over time. As these stories collect, a rhythm continues. Jesus does not instruct through command, he reveals through pattern. The same ideas return from different angles. Trust, attention, depth, responsibility, presence. Not to overwhelm, but to settle. Meaning deepens as repetition softens resistance. These parables are not meant to be completed. They do not conclude cleanly. They continue working long after listening ends. They resurface during rest, during routine, during silence, and slowly, almost unnoticed, they shape direction. Not through urgency, not through fear, but through awareness allowed to remain. Many of the stories Jesus told centered on awareness that comes too late for those who move through life on autopilot. Not because they were careless, but because familiarity dulls attention. Routine can quietly replace reflection. Jesus described people who were active and occupied, yet disconnected from meaning. Their days were full, but their focus was scattered. The parables do not condemn activity, they reveal how easily attention can drift when life feels manageable. One story focused on watching, not anxious watching, not fear-driven anticipation, but quiet readiness. The people in the story were not doing anything wrong. They were simply unprepared for what arrived unexpectedly. The parable does not punish ignorance. It shows how readiness is cultivated long before it is needed. Awareness is not reactive. It is practiced. Another parable described effort that seemed insignificant. A small action, a simple choice. Nothing that appeared impressive, yet over time, that small faithfulness produced quiet stability. Jesus did not elevate dramatic sacrifice. He honored consistency. The story suggests that endurance is built through ordinary obedience, repeated gently, day after day. Jesus also spoke about evaluation, not how others judge, but how perspective forms internally. He described a tendency to notice flaws outwardly while overlooking imbalance within. The parable is not meant to embarrass, it invites honesty. Clarity begins when attention turns inward without defensiveness. Self-awareness creates space for growth without resistance. Some stories focused on patience, waiting without visible reward, working without recognition. Not because reward would never come, but because timing matters. Jesus described servants who remained attentive even when no one was watching. The parable affirms something subtle. Faithfulness often operates unseen, and unseen consistency is often what sustains everything else. Jesus also spoke about trust in uncertain conditions, not trust in outcome, but trust in direction. The stories reveal that clarity is rarely available at the beginning. Movement often begins before certainty arrives. The parables encourage forward motion without panic. Confidence grows through steady steps, not perfect knowledge. As these themes repeat, they do not stack pressure, they soften urgency. Jesus did not intend to create anxiety about getting everything right. He invited attention. Attention to direction. Attention to response. Attention to presence. The stories remain open-ended because they are meant to remain active. The parables continue doing their work long after words fade. They revisit the listener in quiet moments, during repetition, during stillness, during rest. And slowly, almost unnoticed, they cultivate discernment, not through force, not through fear, but through awareness allowed to stay. Many of the stories Jesus told were meant to slow people down, not to interrupt life, but to reshape how it was being lived. He often spoke about moments that seemed ordinary on the surface, yet carried deeper significance when attention was given. The parables did not demand immediate change. They invited careful noticing. One story described fairness from an unexpected angle. People evaluated a situation based on comparison. Who arrived first? Who worked longer? Who deserved more? The parable quietly shifted the focus. Instead of asking what was owed, It asked what had been given. Jesus used this story to show how quickly gratitude disappears when life becomes measured against others. Comparison narrows perspective, and narrowed perspective rarely produces peace. Another parable described movement that felt unnecessary. Someone left security to pursue what seemed insignificant. Time was spent. Effort was given. From the outside, the decision looked inefficient, but value was not determined by scale or logic. Jesus told this story to suggest that worth is sometimes recognized only by those willing to pause and look closely. Attention reveals value. Jesus also spoke about response, not forced response, not public declarations, but quiet alignment. He described people who heard guidance without resistance. They did not argue, they did not delay. They allowed what they heard to shape action naturally. The parable does not celebrate compliance. It highlights openness. Openness allows direction to settle without conflict. Some stories addressed regret, not sharp regret, but gradual realization. Opportunities were present, time was available. Nothing urgent signaled closure. Then suddenly, the moment passed. The parable does not shame delay, it reveals cost. Awareness postponed often becomes clarity remembered. Jesus also spoke about growth that occurs quietly, not through pressure, not through perfection. Growth happened in environments that were protected, patient, and steady. The story reassures those who feel unchanged. Progress may be happening beneath the surface. Silence does not mean stagnation. Across these stories, the same invitation continues, not to strive harder, but to notice more fully. Jesus did not teach to burden the listener. He taught to free attention from distraction and noise. The parables are gentle because they trust time. These stories continue to return, during rest, during repetition, during moments when the mind is quiet. They do not push conclusions. They create space for understanding to form naturally. And in that space, direction becomes clearer. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but steadily. Many of the stories Jesus told invite the listener to reconsider what feels familiar. Not by overturning daily life, but by reframing it. He spoke about ordinary patterns that quietly shape direction long before results appear. The parables are patient because change is often slow. One story described people who assumed stability meant safety. Everything appeared intact, nothing felt threatened, yet what supported them had never been examined closely. The parable does not criticize comfort, it questions assumption. Security is not created by appearance, it is formed by substance beneath the surface. Jesus used this image to suggest that foundations matter even when no strain is present, especially then. Another parable focused on interruption. Someone encountered an unexpected need in the middle of routine. Nothing dramatic forced a response. The moment could have been passed over. The story highlights how attention transforms interruption into responsibility. Jesus did not frame compassion as obligation. He revealed it as awareness allowed to slow the moment down. Jesus also spoke about effort that seemed unrewarded. Work continued without recognition. Time passed without acknowledgement. The parable does not promise quick resolution. It affirms something quieter. Consistency has value even when outcome is delayed. Faithfulness is not fueled by applause. It is sustained by purpose. Some stories addressed misunderstanding. People thought they were aligned because proximity felt close. They participated, They listened, they remained nearby. Yet their attention was divided. The parable does not accuse them of deception. It reveals how closeness can exist without commitment. Understanding requires more than presence. It requires engagement. Jesus also told stories about direction revealed through contrast. Two responses, two paths, two outcomes. Nothing forced separation. Time simply revealed difference. The parables do not rush this process. They allow distinction to emerge naturally. What is rooted remains. What is shallow fades. This is not judgment, it is observation. Across these stories, a deeper rhythm continues. Jesus did not press listeners toward resolution. He trusted reflection. He trusted repetition. He trusted that attention, when given space, would shape direction quietly. The parables ask very little at first, only listening, not analyzing, not concluding, just remaining present. Over time, that presence becomes understanding, and understanding becomes movement. Not sudden, not loud, but steady. These stories remain effective because they do not demand urgency. They accompany life. They surface during rest, during routine, during stillness, and slowly they recalibrate perspective, not by force, but by staying. Many of the stories Jesus told invite the listener to reconsider what feels familiar, not by overturning daily life, but by reframing it. He spoke about ordinary patterns that quietly shape direction long before results appear. The parables are patient because change is often slow. One story described people who assumed stability meant safety. Everything appeared intact, nothing felt threatened, yet what supported them had never been examined closely. The parable does not criticize comfort, it questions assumption. Security is not created by appearance, it is formed by substance beneath the surface. Jesus used this image to suggest that foundations matter even when no strain is present, especially then. Another parable focused on interruption. Someone encountered an unexpected need in the middle of routine. Nothing dramatic forced a response. The moment could have been passed over. The story highlights how attention transforms interruption into responsibility. Jesus did not frame compassion as obligation. He revealed it as awareness allowed to slow the moment down. Jesus also spoke about effort that seemed unrewarded. Work continued without recognition. Time passed without acknowledgement. The parable does not promise quick resolution. It affirms something quieter. Consistency has value even when outcome is delayed. Faithfulness is not fueled by applause. It is sustained by purpose. Some stories addressed misunderstanding. People thought they were aligned because proximity felt close. They participated, they listened, they remained nearby. Yet their attention was divided. The parable does not accuse them of deception. It reveals how closeness can exist without commitment. Understanding requires more than presence. It requires engagement. Jesus also told stories about direction revealed through contrast. Two responses, two paths, two outcomes. Nothing forced separation. Time simply revealed difference. The parables do not rush this process. They allow distinction to emerge naturally. What is rooted remains. What is shallow fades. This is not judgment, it is observation. Across these stories, a deeper rhythm continues. Jesus did not press listeners toward resolution. He trusted reflection. He trusted repetition. He trusted that attention, when given space, would shape direction quietly. The parables ask very little at first, only listening, not analyzing, not concluding, just remaining present. Over time, that presence becomes understanding, and understanding becomes movement. Not sudden, not loud, but steady. These stories remain effective because they do not demand urgency. They accompany life. They surface during rest, during routine, during stillness. And slowly, they recalibrate perspective, not by force, but by staying. Many of the stories Jesus told were meant to be lived with, not solved. They did not arrive with instructions. They arrived with images. Images that could be returned to during ordinary moments, quietly reshaping perspective. Jesus understood that meaning settles best when it is allowed to arrive gradually. One parable focused on exchange. Something valuable was offered, not demanded. Those who recognized its worth responded freely. Those who did not felt no pressure to engage. The story does not judge hesitation. It reveals clarity. When value is truly seen, response feels natural. Indecision fades when recognition becomes clear. Another story described responsibility within community. Someone was entrusted with care, not because they were exceptional, but because they were available. The parable does not elevate status, it highlights presence. Showing up consistently often matters more than dramatic action. Jesus used this image to remind listeners that reliability builds trust quietly over time. Jesus also spoke about attention in moments that felt unimportant. Small interactions, brief decisions, passing thoughts. None appeared decisive alone, yet together they shaped direction. The parable does not warn loudly, it observes gently. What we give attention to repeatedly becomes what guides us. Focus, practiced daily, forms habit, and habit, over time, forms character. Some stories addressed loss without urgency. Something missing was noticed not immediately, but eventually. Once recognized, care followed naturally. The parable does not dramatize the search, it dignifies it. Looking for what matters is not frantic, it is attentive. Value is expressed through willingness to pause and look closely. Jesus also described moments when outcomes were unclear. Choices were made without knowing result. The parable does not promise certainty, it affirms direction. Faithfulness does not require foresight, it requires consistency. Movement forward often begins before clarity arrives. As these parables accumulate, they begin to create rhythm. Not urgency, not pressure, rhythm. A steady return to attention, to presence, to awareness. Jesus trusted that repetition would do its work, that understanding would grow quietly as the listener remained open. These stories remain effective because they respect time. They are not exhausted by a single hearing. They unfold differently depending on the season in which they are heard. And as they return, they continue shaping direction, not by force, but by staying. Many of the stories Jesus told were shaped to meet people in the middle of ordinary life. Not when they were searching for answers, but when they were moving through routine. He spoke into moments where nothing felt especially spiritual, yet everything carried significance. The parables remind the listener that meaning is not confined to extraordinary experiences. It is often formed quietly within everyday movement. One story focused on evaluation that happened too quickly. Something was judged at first glance and dismissed. No deeper attention was given. No patience was applied. Later, what had been overlooked was revealed to be essential. The parable does not shame the judgment, it exposes haste. When attention is rushed, value is easily missed. Jesus used this image to suggest that careful seeing often changes outcome. Another parable described endurance. Work continued without visible reward. Effort was applied consistently. Time passed. Nothing announced progress. The story does not promise recognition. It affirms perseverance. Stability is often built through effort that goes unnoticed. Jesus honored consistency, not because it is impressive, but because it lasts. Jesus also spoke about influence that worked quietly. Change occurred gradually, without announcement. Those involved did not realize what was happening at first. Only later did transformation become clear. The parable highlights how lasting influence rarely draws attention to itself. It works patiently, reshaping what surrounds it over time. Some stories addressed distraction. Many concerns competed for attention. None were unnecessary, none were wrong. Yet together, they crowded what mattered most. The parable does not condemn responsibility, it warns of saturation. When everything is prioritized equally, clarity disappears. Focus requires choice, and choice requires awareness. Jesus also described readiness formed in stillness. Nothing dramatic prepared those who were ready. They simply remained attentive when nothing demanded it. The parable does not frame readiness as fear. It presents it as habit. Awareness practiced during calm moments sustains clarity when change arrives. As these stories continue, their tone remains consistent, gentle, observant, unforced. Jesus trusted time more than urgency. He trusted repetition more than instruction. He trusted that attention, when given space, would lead naturally to understanding. The parables do not seek resolution. They remain open, returning at unexpected moments, during rest, during routine, during reflection. They continue shaping perception, not through pressure, but through presence. And slowly, almost without noticing, direction forms. Many of the stories Jesus told invite patience before understanding. They do not rush meaning. They unfold gradually, often revealing more as attention deepens. Jesus spoke in this way because lasting insight rarely arrives through pressure. It forms quietly as the listener remains open. One parable described judgment that appeared confident yet lacked careful seeing. People evaluated situations based on partial information. What looked certain at first proved incomplete over time. The story does not condemn discernment. It highlights humility. When conclusions are reached too quickly, clarity often suffers. Jesus used this image to remind listeners that understanding benefits from patience. Another story focused on responsibility given without instruction. People were trusted to respond wisely on their own. Some paid attention, others delayed. The parable does not dramatize failure, it observes consequence. Responsibility invites awareness. When awareness fades, direction becomes unclear. Consistency, even when unnoticed, provides stability over time. Jesus also told stories about waiting without frustration. Waiting not as delay, but as readiness maintained quietly. The parable does not praise inactivity, it honors attentiveness. Those who remained aware were prepared when change arrived. Readiness grew from presence, not urgency. Some stories addressed perception. What appeared insignificant carried weight unseen. What drew attention proved temporary. The parable does not reject appearances. It questions reliance on them. Value is often hidden until patience allows it to surface. Jesus also spoke about response when outcomes were uncertain. Movement happened before clarity arrived. The story does not glorify risk, it affirms trust. Direction sometimes becomes clear only after the first step is taken. Faithfulness moves forward without demanding foresight. Across these parables, a steady theme continues. Jesus did not force resolution. He trusted the listener to remain with the story long enough for meaning to mature. Repetition did not dull impact, it deepened it. Understanding grew as attention remained. The stories linger because they respect time. They return during still moments, during routine, during reflection. They are not exhausted quickly. They stay, and in staying, they reshape awareness. Not abruptly, not dramatically, but steadily. Many of the stories Jesus told draw attention to what grows slowly. Not everything meaningful arrives with clarity or urgency. Often, it develops quietly, while life continues as usual. The parables invite the listener to notice what is forming beneath the surface, even when nothing appears to be changing. One story described growth that happened without observation. Seeds were scattered. Time passed. No one stood watching, yet eventually, something appeared. The parable does not praise effort, it highlights trust. Some processes cannot be controlled or accelerated. They require patience and the willingness to allow growth to unfold naturally. Another parable focused on consistency. Small, repeated actions carried more influence than occasional intensity. The story does not celebrate dramatic moments, it affirms steadiness. What is done regularly shapes direction quietly. Jesus used this image to show that reliability creates strength over time. Consistency builds what enthusiasm cannot sustain. Jesus also spoke about value discovered unexpectedly. Something ordinary was re-examined and found to be meaningful. The parable emphasizes attentiveness. Sometimes what transforms direction is not new information, but seeing what was already present with greater clarity. Some stories addressed generosity, not generosity demanded, but generosity chosen. The parables do not frame giving as loss. They reveal how release creates openness. Holding too tightly limits awareness. Letting go creates space for something else to grow. Jesus also spoke about alignment. Hearing and responding were not the same. The story does not criticize listening. It highlights integration. What is heard shapes life only when it is allowed to influence action. Awareness becomes meaningful when it changes direction. Across these parables, a quiet balance emerges. Effort and trust, action and patience, attention and release. Jesus did not demand perfection, he invited presence. The stories remain effective because they are gentle. They do not overpower the listener. They stay nearby. Over time, these stories continue returning, during calm moments, during repetition, during rest. They do not conclude with certainty, they allow meaning to unfold gradually. And through that unfolding, understanding forms. Not suddenly, not forcefully, but steadily. Many of the stories Jesus told invite listeners to reconsider what success truly looks like. Not achievement measured publicly, but direction formed quietly. He often spoke about outcomes that appeared reversed, where expectation did not match result. The parables gently unsettle without creating anxiety. They loosen certainty so understanding can deepen. One story described people who assumed position guaranteed insight. They were informed, they were experienced, they were confident. Yet, confidence narrowed their vision. The parable does not shame knowledge, it reveals limitation. Awareness requires openness. When certainty becomes fixed, learning slows. Jesus used this image to show that humility creates room for growth. Another parable focused on timing. Opportunities appeared available, then quietly passed. No announcement marked the moment. Those who paid attention recognized it. Those who did not realized too late. The story does not threaten, it clarifies. Attention practiced regularly sharpens recognition when timing matters. Jesus also told stories about exchange. Something valuable was released voluntarily. The choice was deliberate. Nothing forced it. The parable does not celebrate sacrifice, it highlights priority. What is relinquished reveals what is valued most. Direction becomes clear through what we are willing to hold loosely. Some parables described effort that felt unnoticed. Work continued. Care remained steady. No immediate affirmation followed. The story honors faithfulness without spotlight. Consistency, practiced quietly, often supports more than dramatic success ever could. Jesus also spoke about proximity. People were close to something meaningful without engaging deeply. They listened, but did not remain attentive. The parable does not condemn nearness. It shows that closeness alone does not create understanding. Engagement transforms presence into clarity. Across these stories, the same invitation returns. Not to reach conclusions quickly, but to remain present longer. Jesus trusted that time would do what pressure could not. Meaning was allowed to mature. Understanding developed as attention stayed engaged. The parables continue shaping awareness not through answers, but through reflection. They do not demand agreement. They invite consideration. Over time, they soften assumptions and sharpen discernment. As listening continues, these stories blend into rhythm. They return during repetition, during calm moments, during stillness. They do not seek resolution. They accompany the listener. And in that companionship, direction forms. Not abruptly, not forcefully, but steadily. Many of the stories Jesus told invite listeners to slow their expectations. Not everything meaningful arrives with clarity at once. Often, understanding develops gradually as attention remains steady and assumptions loosen. The parables create room for reflection to grow naturally. One story described people who believed arrival meant completion. They had reached a point of comfort. Nothing felt unfinished. Yet something essential had never been cultivated. The parable does not criticize achievement. It reveals incompleteness. Reaching a destination does not always mean becoming rooted. Stability requires depth, not just arrival. Another parable focused on care that extended beyond obligation. Someone noticed what others overlooked, not because it was required, but because attention allowed space for compassion to emerge. The story does not present kindness as heroism, it presents it as awareness expressed through action. Care follows naturally when attention is not rushed. Jesus also spoke about continuity, work that continued even when enthusiasm faded, faithfulness that remained after novelty passed. The parable does not reward excitement, it affirms endurance. What lasts is often sustained by commitment rather than emotion. Consistency carries meaning long after energy subsides. Some stories addressed choice made repeatedly rather than once. No single decision defined the outcome. Instead, direction was shaped through patterns. The parable does not dramatize moments, it highlights habit. What is practiced quietly forms trajectory over time. Direction becomes visible only after distance is traveled. Jesus also told stories about awareness forming in stages. At first, insight was partial. Later, it became clearer. The parable does not shame early misunderstanding. It honors progress. Understanding is allowed to mature. Clarity that develops patiently often lasts longer than certainty acquired quickly. Across these stories, a shared calm remains. Jesus did not rush listeners toward conclusions. He trusted the process of reflection. He allowed meaning to surface gradually. Attention was not forced, it was invited. The parables continue working because they respect time. They revisit the listener during repetition and rest. They do not insist on resolution, they remain present. And through their presence, perspective shifts. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but steadily. Some of the stories Jesus told linger because they resemble moments people recognize from their own lives. They feel familiar before they feel meaningful. One such story describes someone who believed progress meant movement. They stayed busy, they stayed active, they stayed occupied. From the outside, everything looked productive, but inwardly, direction was never examined. The story does not criticize effort, it reveals absence. Movement without reflection can feel like progress while leading nowhere. Another parable described a moment that came quietly. No warning announced it. No signal demanded attention. Those who noticed had been paying attention long before anything changed. Those who missed it realized only after it passed. The story does not shame delay. It shows how awareness is trained. Readiness is not instinct. It is cultivated through habit. Jesus also told a story about someone who received something valuable without immediately recognizing its weight. At first, it seemed ordinary, useful, but not essential. Only later, when pressure came, did its importance become clear. The parable gently suggests that many foundations are tested after they are chosen, not before. Another story described trust that was exercised without certainty. A decision was made before outcomes were visible. Nothing guaranteed success, yet movement happened anyway. The parable does not glorify risk. It honors direction. Sometimes the right path only becomes clear after taking the first step. Some parables focused on return, not dramatic return, not public apology, just quiet recognition. Someone realized they had drifted. They did not argue with that realization, they responded. The story emphasizes humility. Change begins not with explanation, but with acknowledgement. Across these stories, a steady pattern emerges. Jesus did not overwhelm listeners with instruction. He showed them moments they already understood. He trusted that recognition would do the work. These narratives remain effective because they do not push conclusions. They allow the listener to connect quietly, to remember similar moments, to notice patterns. And in that recognition, understanding settles without resistance. And as these stories continued, Jesus often returned to moments where understanding formed quietly, almost unnoticed. He spoke about people who assumed stability meant certainty. Life felt ordered, routine felt reliable, nothing seemed out of place. Yet the parable revealed that stability without reflection can rest on unexamined ground. When pressure eventually arrived, what had never been tested was suddenly exposed. The story does not criticize comfort, it reveals fragility. Foundations are not proven during calm seasons. They are revealed when circumstances change. Jesus then told another story about responsibility received gradually. Nothing overwhelming was given, nothing dramatic was demanded. Only attentiveness. Some noticed what they were entrusted with and remained engaged. Others delayed, assuming there would always be time. The parable does not frame delay as rebellion. It frames it as assumption. Assumption quietly erodes urgency. Direction forms long before consequence appears. He also spoke about effort that appeared equal on the surface but differed beneath. Two responses looked similar. Both involved activity, both appeared committed, yet one response was rooted in awareness, the other in habit. Over time, that difference widened. The parable does not condemn habit. It shows its limit. Habit sustains movement, but awareness sustains direction. Jesus often described moments where outcomes felt delayed. Nothing seemed to change. Effort continued without visible result. The stories do not promise immediate clarity. They affirm patience. Some growth occurs beneath awareness, unseen but active. The absence of evidence is not the absence of progress. Waiting, when paired with attentiveness, can be formative. Another story described recognition that arrived late but honestly. Someone realized they had misjudged importance. What was dismissed had carried weight all along. The parable does not shame misjudgment. It honors correction. Insight gained late still reshapes direction. What matters is not flawless perception, but willingness to adjust. Across these teachings, Jesus trusted time. He trusted repetition. He trusted that meaning, when allowed to remain nearby, would surface naturally. The stories did not compete for attention. They accompanied life. They returned quietly during stillness, during routine, during rest. And as these parables overlap, they begin to feel less like lessons and more like reminders. Not instructions imposed, but truths resurfacing. They do not demand agreement, they invite awareness. And awareness, when sustained, reshapes direction without force. These stories continue working because they do not insist on resolution. They stay present, they wait. They allow understanding to arrive in its own time. And in that waiting, something steady forms. Not urgency, not pressure, but clarity that lasts. And as Jesus continued speaking, many of the stories returned again to the idea of direction. Not sudden change, but gradual movement shaped over time. He described how people often believe that intentions alone are enough. Good intentions, honest plans, reasonable goals. Yet, intention without alignment slowly loses strength. The parables do not dismiss intention. They reveal what intention needs in order to endure. Direction is sustained when intention is paired with attentiveness. One story describes someone who heard guidance clearly and agreed with it sincerely. Nothing was misunderstood. Yet agreement remained internal. Action was postponed. The parable does not accuse resistance. It highlights delay. Delay rarely feels dangerous at first. It feels harmless, temporary, easily justified. But over time, delay quietly reshapes commitment. What is not acted upon slowly loses urgency. Another parable focused on comparison. People measured their progress against others around them. Some felt ahead, some felt behind. Attention shifted away from direction and toward position. The story does not reject awareness of others, it reveals how comparison distorts focus. When attention moves outward, clarity inward often fades. Growth becomes performance. Faithfulness becomes measurement. Jesus used this story to gently return attention to personal responsibility. He also spoke about trust expressed during uncertainty. Not trust in outcome, but trust in direction already chosen. The parable describes movement without full visibility, steps taken without confirmation. The story does not praise recklessness, it affirms steadiness. Sometimes the correct path is confirmed only after it is walked. Certainty often follows commitment, not the other way around. Another story described recognition arriving through stillness. Nothing dramatic occurred, no conflict forced awareness. Space simply allowed reflection, and in that quiet space, clarity emerged. The parable suggests that understanding is not always discovered through effort. Sometimes it appears when noise recedes. As these teachings continued, a consistent tone remained. Jesus did not elevate urgency. He did not rush response. He trusted awareness. He trusted time. He trusted that people, when allowed space, could recognize direction for themselves. These parables remain effective because they respect the listener. They do not pressure agreement. They do not rush conclusion. They create room for meaning to surface gradually, for insight to form without resistance. And as the stories continue to overlap, they feel less like separate teachings and more like a shared current, a steady movement beneath ordinary life, gently shaping perception, quietly adjusting direction, not through force, not through fear, but through presence that remains. And as the stories continued, Jesus often returned to the space between knowing and living. Not ignorance, not rebellion, but the quiet distance between understanding something and allowing it to shape behavior. He described how people can recognize truth without resisting it, yet still remain unchanged. The parables do not shame this distance, they illuminate it. Change rarely begins with resistance. It often begins with hesitation. One story described a moment when decision could no longer be delayed. Up until that point, everything felt optional. Time felt abundant. Opportunity felt open. But eventually, a moment arrived where response mattered. The parable does not threaten consequence. It reveals inevitability. Every direction leads somewhere, and delay itself becomes a direction over time. Another parable focused on endurance after initial excitement faded. At first, enthusiasm carried movement, energy felt strong, commitment felt easy. But as novelty passed, attention weakened. The story does not condemn loss of excitement. It reveals what remains when excitement is gone. What lasts is not fueled by emotion. It is sustained by intention, repeated quietly. Jesus also spoke about attention that becomes divided slowly, not through conflict, but through accumulation. Responsibilities multiplied, concerns layered, distractions blended in. None felt wrong individually, yet together they crowded awareness. The parable does not reject responsibility, it reveals saturation. When everything feels important, discernment struggles to breathe. Clarity requires space. Another story described recognition that came only after reflection. Someone realized They had been measuring progress incorrectly. What appeared productive had not been meaningful. The parable does not condemn effort. It reframes evaluation. Movement does not always equal direction. Busyness can coexist with stagnation. Understanding this allows recalibration without shame. As Jesus continued speaking, his stories remained steady. He did not escalate intensity. He did not introduce urgency. He trusted accumulation. He trusted repetition. He trusted that meaning would surface naturally through sustained listening. The parables do not demand response in the moment they are heard. They return later, during repetition, during quiet tasks, during stillness. They revisit familiar moments with new perspective. And as they return, they continue shaping awareness. Not dramatically, not forcefully, but steadily, quietly adjusting direction, one recognition at a time. And as these teachings unfolded, Jesus continued to return to the quiet power of awareness. Not awareness sharpened by pressure, but awareness formed through patience. He described how people often wait for clarity before movement, when clarity itself grows through movement. The parables do not rush this tension. They sit with it. They allow the listener to notice how often certainty is requested before commitment is given. One story described trust expressed without guarantee. A choice was made without seeing the full path ahead. Nothing ensured success, nothing promised ease, yet direction was chosen deliberately. The parable does not celebrate boldness, it honors steadiness. Faithfulness is not impulsive action, it is consistent movement, aligned with intention. Another parable focused on restraint. Someone possessed the ability to respond harshly, but chose not to. Power was present. Opportunity existed, yet control was exercised. The story does not glorify patience as passivity. It shows discernment. Strength is often revealed not through reaction, but through measured response. Jesus also spoke about value that remained unnoticed because attention was scattered. What mattered most was not hidden deliberately, it was simply overlooked. The parable suggests that insight is rarely unavailable. More often, it is unrecognized. Attention, when focused, changes what is seen. Some stories addressed consequence that arrived gently rather than abruptly. Nothing collapsed suddenly, nothing failed dramatically. Direction drifted gradually until distance became noticeable. The parable does not threaten outcome. It describes process. Trajectories form quietly through repeated choices. Awareness interrupts drift. As the stories continued, Jesus did not multiply complexity, he simplified focus. The same ideas returned from different angles: trust, attention, direction, patience. Not to overwhelm, but to settle. Meaning deepened as resistance softened. These parables remain effective because they refuse urgency. They do not force realization, they invite return. They revisit ordinary moments with gentle clarity. And as listening continues, these stories blend into rhythm. They accompany daily life. They surface without demand. They reshape perception without conflict. And over time, direction becomes clearer. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but steadily. And as the listening deepened, the stories Jesus told continued to draw attention to how slowly understanding often forms. Not all insight arrives at once. Much of it accumulates quietly, layer by layer, through repeated exposure. The parables are shaped for this kind of listening. They do not insist on immediate clarity. They allow meaning to approach gradually. One story described expectation. People anticipated results based on appearance. What seemed strong was trusted without question. What appeared weak was dismissed too quickly. The parable does not condemn judgment. It exposes assumption. Assumption feels efficient, but it rarely sees deeply. Jesus used this image to suggest that discernment requires patience. Another parable focused on attention sustained when nothing obvious was happening. Days passed without change. Work continued without recognition. Nothing marked progress. Yet the story affirms something subtle. Continuity matters. Stability is often maintained by those who continue caring even when momentum fades. Consistency becomes the unseen structure that holds everything together. Jesus also spoke about influence that operated beneath awareness. Change did not arrive with announcement. It spread quietly. Those affected did not notice it at first. Only later did transformation become apparent. The parable highlights how lasting impact is rarely immediate. It unfolds while attention is elsewhere. Some stories addressed misalignment, discovered gently. Nothing dramatic exposed it. Time simply revealed that direction and intention were no longer matching. The parable does not shame misalignment, it honors correction. Adjustment made honestly can restore alignment without resistance. As Jesus continued, he returned again to the theme of readiness. Not readiness driven by anxiety, but readiness shaped by awareness. Those prepared had not been watching constantly, they had simply remained attentive during ordinary moments. The parable suggests that readiness is practiced quietly when nothing seems urgent. Across these reflections, the same calm invitation remains. Stay present, stay attentive, allow meaning to mature without forcing outcome. Jesus trusted that time and repetition would do their work. And as these parables continue to circulate, they become less like instruction and more like accompaniment. They walk alongside routine. They return during stillness. They remind gently, without demand. And through this steady presence, direction slowly clarifies, not through urgency, not through pressure, but through awareness that remains. And as the stories continued to unfold, Jesus often drew attention to how easily people confuse familiarity with understanding. Hearing something often does not mean hearing it deeply. The parables acknowledge this gently. They do not accuse the listener of neglect. They recognize the human tendency to grow comfortable too quickly. Comfort can dull attention without being noticed. One story described repetition that slowly lost meaning. Actions were performed regularly, words were repeated faithfully, yet awareness was no longer present. The parable does not criticize consistency. It reveals what happens when consistency continues without reflection. Habit maintains structure. Attention gives it life. Without attention, even good practices lose direction. Another parable focused on humility formed through recognition. Someone realized they had misunderstood their own position, not through failure, but through perspective. The story does not humiliate, it clarifies. Understanding one's limits creates space for growth. When certainty loosens, learning becomes possible. Jesus also spoke about trust that endured uncertainty. The outcome remained unclear. The path felt incomplete, yet commitment remained steady. The parable does not glorify endurance as suffering. It affirms loyalty to direction rather than outcome. Faithfulness persists when motivation fades, but purpose remains. Some stories addressed perception over time. What once felt important slowly revealed its emptiness. What felt insignificant grew meaningful. The parable suggests that value is often recognized late, after experience refines judgment. Patience allows clarity to replace assumption. As Jesus continued teaching, his tone remained unpressured. He did not escalate intensity to hold attention. He trusted repetition. He trusted familiarity. He trusted that meaning, when allowed to stay near, would shape the listener quietly. The parables continue working because they do not demand completion. They return repeatedly, each time offering a slightly different angle. Not new truths, but deeper understanding. And as listening continues, these stories blend into the background of life. They accompany daily tasks. They resurface during rest. They remind without interrupting. And through this gentle repetition, awareness is refined. Direction becomes clearer, not abruptly, not dramatically, but steadily. And as the reflections carried on, Jesus continued to draw attention to how easily people misunderstand growth. Many assume growth is visible, measurable, obvious. The parables suggest otherwise. They describe growth that happens quietly, without announcement, often unnoticed, even by those experiencing it. Understanding matures slowly, shaped more by consistency than by intensity. One story described change that took place gradually. Nothing dramatic marked its beginning, no single decision created it. Instead, direction shifted through repeated choices made without urgency. The parable does not glorify patience as waiting alone. It honors patience as attentiveness sustained over time. What grows quietly often lasts longer than what grows quickly. Another parable focused on response when clarity arrived late. Someone realized, after time had passed, that an earlier choice had shaped everything that followed. The story does not condemn delay, it reveals awareness. Recognition, even when delayed, can still reshape direction if it is welcomed honestly. Change does not require perfect timing, it requires openness. Jesus also spoke about the difference between being occupied and being attentive. Activity filled the day. Responsibilities multiplied. Nothing felt unnecessary. Yet awareness slowly faded beneath constant motion. The parable does not criticize responsibility, it highlights imbalance. When attention is spread too thin, discernment weakens. Clarity requires space to be noticed. Some stories addressed alignment. Not dramatic misalignment, but subtle drifting. Direction remained familiar, yet intention shifted slightly. Over time, distance became apparent. The parable does not frighten, it explains. Drift is rarely sudden. It happens quietly when attention relaxes. Awareness interrupts drift before distance grows too great. As Jesus continued speaking, he maintained a steady cadence. He did not vary tone sharply. He did not demand conclusion. He trusted that these ideas, revisited gently, would settle where needed. The parables continue to function as companions rather than commands. They walk alongside daily routine. They resurface during still moments. They offer perspective without pressure. And over time, through repetition and rest, these stories reshape awareness. Not through urgency, not through fear, but through presence that remains. And as the parables continued to gather, Jesus often spoke about insight that arrived through contrast. Not because contrast was dramatic, but because it clarified quietly. Side by side, two responses revealed two directions. The stories did not assign blame, they simply observed. Time made distinction visible. One parable described two approaches that looked similar at first. Both involved effort. Both appeared committed, yet one was rooted in awareness, the other in routine. Over time, that difference became clear. The parable does not criticize routine, it reveals its limitation. Routine sustains motion. Awareness sustains direction. Another story focused on recognition that came through loss. Only when something was missing did its value become clear. The parable does not glorify regret, it honors realization. Loss can refine attention when it is allowed to teach rather than harden. Understanding often deepens after reflection follows experience. Jesus also spoke about trust that did not depend on visible progress. Effort continued even when outcome remained hidden. The story affirms perseverance without promising reward. Faithfulness, it suggests, is not fueled by results. It is sustained by alignment between intention and action. Some stories addressed correction received without resistance. Someone recognized misalignment and adjusted quietly. No defense followed, no explanation was demanded. The parable highlights humility. Correction accepted honestly prevents greater distance later. Adjustment made early protects direction over time. As Jesus continued, his stories remained steady. He did not escalate urgency to command attention. He relied on consistency. He trusted familiarity. He trusted that meaning, when allowed to remain present, would settle naturally. The parables function not as demands, but as invitations. They invite the listener to remain aware, to notice quietly, to allow direction to form without pressure. And as these stories repeat, they begin to feel woven into the background of life. They surface during rest. They return during routine. They remind gently without interruption. And through that gentle presence, clarity continues to grow. Not suddenly, not forcefully, but steadily. And as the stories continued, Jesus often spoke about patience that reshapes expectation. Not patience that waits passively, but patience that remains attentive without demanding immediate clarity. The parables acknowledge how natural it is to want results quickly. They gently redirect attention toward formation rather than outcome. One story described a process that unfolded beyond human control. Effort was applied appropriately, yet growth followed its own timing. The parable does not diminish effort. It places it within limits. Some outcomes cannot be forced. They mature according to conditions not immediately visible. Trust, in this sense, is learning when to act and when to allow. Another parable focused on expectation that narrowed perspective. People anticipated a certain result and overlooked what was already present. The story does not criticize hope, it reveals fixation. When expectation becomes rigid, awareness often narrows. Meaning may arrive differently than anticipated. Attention that remains flexible recognizes it when it appears. Jesus also spoke about attention that softened judgment. Instead of reacting immediately, space was given for understanding. The parable does not discourage discernment. It encourages restraint. Pausing before judgment creates room for clarity to emerge. Response, shaped by reflection, often carries wisdom that reaction lacks. Some stories address time as an essential element. Change did not occur instantly. Days and seasons passed before direction became visible. The parable does not frame waiting as delay. It frames it as participation. Time itself plays a role in formation. Patience allows alignment to strengthen quietly. As these teachings unfolded, Jesus maintained a steady presence. He did not shift tone abruptly. He did not demand resolution. He trusted that understanding, given room to develop, would endure. The parables continue their work because they move at the pace of life. They do not race ahead of experience, they walk alongside it. They revisit familiar ground with renewed perspective. And through this steady repetition, attention deepens, assumptions soften, direction clarifies. Not dramatically, not urgently, but steadily. And as the parables flowed together, Jesus continued to draw attention to the quiet tension between control and trust. People naturally seek control as a form of safety. Plans are made, systems are built, outcomes are predicted. The parables do not reject planning. They reveal its limit. There comes a point where control must yield to trust for growth to continue. One story described effort that reached its natural boundary. Everything possible had been done. Preparation was complete. Responsibility was fulfilled. Yet outcome still remained uncertain. The parable does not criticize preparation, it clarifies dependence. Not everything meaningful can be secured through effort alone. Some outcomes require release after diligence has been applied. Another parable focused on learning that arrived through reflection rather than action. Nothing new occurred externally, circumstances stayed the same, yet understanding shifted. The story highlights how change can occur internally before anything changes outwardly. Clarity often begins as perspective long before it becomes direction. Jesus also spoke about humility that allowed adjustment, not humiliation, not defeat. Simply the willingness to recognize misalignment and respond honestly. The parable does not portray humility as weakness. It presents it as strength that preserves direction. Correction accepted early prevents greater deviation later. Some stories addressed endurance when recognition never arrived. Effort continued quietly. Care was sustained without visible affirmation. The parable affirms that value is not dependent on acknowledgement. Faithfulness does not require applause. It requires alignment between intention and action. As Jesus continued teaching, he resisted the urge to escalate. He did not increase intensity to hold attention. He trusted the listener to remain. He trusted repetition. He trusted time. The parables remain effective because they do not overwhelm. They remain gentle. They remain present. They return when needed without announcing themselves. And through this steady companionship, awareness grows, perspective shifts, direction clarifies, not suddenly, not forcefully, but steadily. And as the teaching continued, Jesus returned again to the difference between reaction and response. Reaction happens quickly. It draws from impulse, from habit, from emotion. Response takes shape more slowly. It creates space between what is felt and what is chosen. The parables do not suppress emotion. They refine it. They show how awareness transforms reaction into response. One story described a moment when restraint changed everything. The situation invited retaliation. Justification was available. Approval from others was likely. yet restraint was chosen. The parable does not portray restraint as weakness. It reveals control. Strength expressed through restraint often carries greater weight than strength expressed through force. Another parable focused on loyalty, tested quietly, not during crisis, but during routine. Consistency was required when attention drifted and enthusiasm faded. The story does not dramatize testing, it normalizes it. Commitment is often revealed not in intensity, but in continuity. What remains steady when nothing is exciting reveals true alignment. Jesus also spoke about perception shaped over time. Early impressions felt confident, judgments were made quickly. Later, with more perspective, those impressions softened. The parable honors learning. Understanding that evolves is not failure, it is growth. Humility allows perception to mature without defensiveness. Some stories addressed influence that went unnoticed by its source. Change occurred quietly. Those affected did not realize who had influenced them or when it had happened. The parable suggests that the most lasting influence often remains invisible. Impact does not always announce itself. It unfolds through presence maintained over time. As Jesus continued speaking, he did not rush towards summary. He allowed ideas to linger. He trusted repetition. He trusted the listener to stay with the rhythm. He trusted that meaning would surface gradually through familiarity. The parables do not demand reaction. They invite reflection. They revisit ordinary moments with subtle clarity. They walk alongside daily life without urgency. And through this steady presence, awareness deepens. Judgment softens. Direction becomes clearer. Not abruptly, not dramatically, but steadily. And as the listening continued, Jesus often returned to the idea of learning that unfolds over time. Not everything becomes clear when it is first encountered. Some understanding forms only after experience has softened certainty. The parables respect this process. They do not insist on instant clarity. They allow insight to mature gradually. One story described confidence that felt strong at the beginning. Decisions were made quickly. Commitments felt sincere. Yet when circumstances shifted, that confidence weakened. The parable does not mock confidence. It reveals what sustains it. Confidence rooted only in feeling rarely lasts. Confidence grounded in awareness endures change. Another parable focused on attention that quietly redirected outcome. A small decision made without urgency changed everything that followed. Nothing dramatic marked the moment. Yet over time, its influence became clear. The story honors attentiveness. Small choices, made consistently, often shape direction more than major decisions made rarely. Jesus also spoke about discernment that required slowing down. Immediate judgment felt efficient. Pausing felt unnecessary. Yet when space was created, clarity emerged. The parable does not condemn decisiveness, it invites patience. Discernment benefits from room to breathe. What is rushed often lacks depth. Some stories addressed responsibility, accepted quietly. No recognition followed, no affirmation was given. Yet responsibility was carried faithfully. The parable affirms that meaning does not require applause. Commitment practiced privately often sustains more than effort performed publicly. As Jesus continued teaching, he remained steady. He did not seek to impress. He trusted familiarity. He trusted repetition. He trusted the listener to stay present long enough for meaning to settle. The parables continue to work because they feel safe to remain with. They do not demand resolution. They allow reflection to happen naturally. They revisit ordinary experience with subtle insight. And over time, that insight reshapes awareness. Perspective widens. Assumptions soften. Direction clarifies. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but steadily.
And as the teaching moved forward,
Jesus continued to speak about understanding that grows through attentiveness rather than effort. Many people assume that clarity is earned through striving. More effort, more activity, more certainty. The parables gently question that assumption. They suggest that understanding often arrives not when effort increases, but when attention deepens. One story described correction that arrived without confrontation. Nothing dramatic occurred, no argument forced awareness. Time simply revealed that direction had shifted. The parable does not shame the one corrected. It honors responsiveness. Adjustment made early restores alignment quietly. Correction resisted often grows heavier over time. Another parable focused on restraint during moments of opportunity. Something could have been claimed immediately. Permission existed. Justification was easy. Yet waiting was chosen. The story does not glorify delay. It reveals discernment. Knowing when not to act often preserves what matters most. Wisdom is sometimes expressed through patience rather than movement. Jesus also spoke about influence that did not seek recognition. Presence was maintained consistently. Care was given without announcement. Those affected did not realize when influence occurred. The parable affirms that true influence rarely announces itself. It shapes quietly through reliability and sustained attention. Some stories addressed alignment that was restored gently. Nothing collapsed, nothing was lost. Attention simply returned to what had been neglected. The parable reassures that correction does not require failure. Awareness alone can redirect outcome before damage occurs. As Jesus continued, he maintained the same calm rhythm. He did not escalate tone. He did not rush conclusion. He trusted the power of repeated exposure. He trusted that meaning, when allowed to linger, would settle naturally. The parables remain effective because they do not exhaust the listener. They feel familiar, but not empty. They allow thought to drift without disengaging. They stay present without demanding focus. And through that gentle consistency, perception slowly adjusts. Attention sharpens. Direction becomes clearer. Not through urgency, not through force, but through awareness that remains.
and as the stories continued to flow,
Jesus often spoke about understanding that emerges through humility. Not humility expressed through words, but humility shown by willingness to learn. The parables do not elevate ignorance. They honor openness. Those who remain teachable continue to grow long after certainty would have stopped them. One story describes someone who believed they already understood. Experience had shaped confidence. Familiarity reinforced assumption. Yet a moment arrived that challenged perspective. The parable does not criticize experience. It reveals its limit. Experience informs wisdom only when it remains open to correction. Learning requires space for perception to expand. Another parable focused on priority revealed through choice. Time was limited. Attention was divided. Not everything could be held equally. The story does not condemn responsibility. It clarifies importance. What receives consistent attention reveals what truly matters. Priority is rarely announced, it is practiced. Jesus also spoke about awareness that prevented regret. Someone noticed a pattern forming quietly, not dramatic enough to demand immediate action, yet meaningful enough to warrant reflection. The parable honors attentiveness. Recognizing direction early allows gentle adjustment before consequence hardens. Some stories addressed peace maintained despite uncertainty. Outcomes remained unclear. Nothing guaranteed resolution, yet inner steadiness remained. The parable does not promise control, it affirms trust. Peace grows not from certainty of outcome, but from alignment of intention. As Jesus continued teaching, he resisted dramatic conclusions. He trusted process. He trusted time. He trusted that these stories, heard repeatedly, would form understanding naturally. The parables continue working because they feel safe to stay with. They do not demand decision. They do not rush action. They accompany reflection without pressure. And as they accompany reflection, they quietly reshape awareness. Expectation softens, judgment relaxes, direction steadies. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but steadily.
And as the stories continued,
Jesus often returned to the space between possession and stewardship. People tend to treat what they hold as something owned outright: time, opportunity, influence. The parables gently reframe this. They suggest that much of what feels owned is actually entrusted. How something is held matters as much as what is held. One story described responsibility received without explanation. Nothing detailed was given. No step-by-step instruction followed. Only trust. The parable does not portray trust as risk. It reveals dignity. Being entrusted acknowledges capacity. Response reveals readiness. What is done with responsibility often matters more than how much responsibility exists. Another parable focused on loss that was not immediately recognized. Something slowly drifted away. Nothing dramatic occurred. Only later did absence become clear. The story does not shame neglect. It illustrates attention. Loss often happens quietly when awareness relaxes. Care sustained over time protects what matters without force. Jesus also spoke about misjudgment that softened with reflection. Initial impressions felt certain. Confidence was strong. Then, perspective widened. The parable honors reconsideration. Changing understanding is not weakness. It is maturity. Growth often includes letting go of earlier conclusions. Some stories addressed responsibility that extended beyond comfort. Care was required when conditions were inconvenient. The parable does not glorify sacrifice. It highlights presence. Showing up when it is easier not to reveals alignment more clearly than grand gestures. As Jesus continued, he remained unhurried. He did not compress meaning. He allowed themes to circle gently. Trust, attention, responsibility, awareness, each returning from a different angle. The parables do not seek to impress, they seek to remain. They stay close to ordinary life. They resurface during reflection without demanding attention. And through this continued presence, understanding settles more deeply. Assumptions soften. Perspective adjusts. Direction clarifies. Not abruptly, not dramatically, but steadily. And as the reflections carried on, Jesus continued to speak about boundaries that quietly protect what matters. Not walls built from fear, but limits shaped by wisdom. The parables suggest that freedom is not found in endless openness. It is sustained through discernment. Knowing where to invest attention preserves clarity. One story described generosity that was misdirected. Resources were offered widely without consideration. What was meant for care was wasted through neglect. The parable does not discourage generosity, it refines it. Giving guided by awareness serves purpose. Giving without attention often drains without effect. Another parable focused on correction received without defense. Nothing forced acceptance. No authority-imposed agreement. Understanding arrived through recognition rather than pressure. The story honors humility. Correction welcomed strengthens alignment. Correction resisted hardens distance. Jesus also spoke about awareness that returns after drifting, not through failure, but through remembering. Something familiar resurfaced. Attention was restored. The parable reassures that return does not require shame. Direction can be reclaimed through simple attentiveness. Some stories addressed influence that carried weight quietly. Words spoken calmly, actions taken gently. Nothing dramatic marked them, yet over time, their effect became evident. The parable highlights how impact grows through consistency rather than force. Presence, sustained, often shapes more than power displayed. As Jesus continued, his stories remained accessible. He did not complicate language. He did not multiply instruction. He trusted repetition to deepen meaning. Each return invited another layer of understanding. The parables remain near because they do not overwhelm. They drift in and out of attention. They accompany rest. They revisit routine. They do their work quietly. And through this quiet companionship, awareness matures. Judgment softens. Direction stabilizes. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but steadily. And as the quiet rhythm continued, Jesus returned again to the difference between movement and direction. Activity filled many lives. Schedules were full. Responsibilities were real. Effort was genuine. Yet the parables gently questioned whether movement alone was shaping the destination. They did not reject busyness. They asked what busyness was serving. One story described effort, applied faithfully, but without reflection. Work continued day after day. Nothing appeared wrong. Yet attention had shifted away from purpose. The parable does not criticize diligence. It reveals the need for alignment. Effort carries weight only when guided by awareness. Otherwise, it becomes motion without meaning. Another parable focused on listening that remained shallow. Words were heard, ideas were acknowledged, but nothing settled deeply enough to change response. The story does not shame listening. It illustrates the difference between hearing and internalizing. Understanding that remains external rarely transforms direction. Awareness must be allowed to move inward. Jesus also spoke about clarity that arrived after release. Something tightly held was finally loosened. Not lost, not abandoned, simply released from control. The parable suggests that clarity often emerges when grip relaxes. Holding less tightly sometimes reveals more clearly. Some stories addressed patience, expressed through restraint. Reaction was delayed deliberately. Nothing urgent demanded response. Space was created. The parable honors the wisdom of pausing. Not every moment requires action, some require presence. Pausing preserves discernment. As Jesus continued teaching, He did not intensify emotion. He maintained steadiness. He trusted familiarity. He trusted that repetition would refine understanding. Each return invited deeper reflection without pressure. The parables continue functioning because they do not rush awareness. They feel safe to remain with. They drift alongside routine. They return without demand. And through this steady rhythm, perspective continues to shift. Attention settles. Direction clarifies. Not through urgency, not through force, but through presence that remains.
And as the rhythm carried on,
Jesus continued to speak about weight. Not physical weight, but the weight carried by decisions that seem small at the time they are made. The parables suggest that life is rarely shaped by dramatic turning points. It is shaped by accumulation, by what is chosen again and again when no one is watching. One story described a pattern that felt harmless. Nothing alarming appeared. Each choice seemed reasonable. Each step felt justified. Yet direction shifted quietly. The parable does not accuse intention. It reveals trajectory. Where something leads is often clearer in hindsight than in the moment it is chosen. Awareness slows that drift. Another parable focused on rest. Not rest as escape, but rest as restoration. Someone paused deliberately instead of pushing forward endlessly. The story does not glorify inactivity. It reframes renewal. Sustained effort requires intentional rest. Without rest, discernment weakens and direction blurs. Jesus also spoke about expectation that softened over time. What was once demanded immediately became something patiently awaited. The parable highlights maturity. Growth often transforms impatience into understanding. Learning when to wait is part of learning what truly matters. Some stories addressed fairness seen from a new angle. Comparison created frustration. Assumptions distorted gratitude. The parable does not dismiss justice. It widens perspective. What is received freely cannot be measured accurately through comparison. Gratitude restores clarity that comparison erodes. As Jesus continued teaching, he did not seek dramatic emphasis. He trusted consistency. He trusted that ideas, revisited calmly, would settle more deeply than urgency ever could. The parables remain effective because they allow the listener to remain at ease. They do not provoke decision. They cultivate awareness. They linger gently during routine moments and quiet tasks. And through this gentle presence, understanding continues to grow. Perspective shifts. Judgment softens. Direction steadies. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but steadily.
and as the listening continued,
Jesus returned to the idea that attention shapes experience. Not what is intended, but what is repeatedly noticed slowly becomes central. The parables draw awareness to how easily focus drifts toward what is loud, urgent, or demanding, while what is essential waits quietly. One story described priorities revealed over time, not through words, but through behavior. What was given time consistently proved to be what mattered most. The parable does not accuse distraction. It reveals truth gently. Attention is honest. It shows where care is invested without needing explanation. Another parable focused on correction that arrived through consequence rather than instruction. Nothing was stated directly. Experience itself became the teacher. The story does not glorify hardship. It acknowledges learning. Some lessons arrive not because they are chosen, but because they are necessary. Awareness gained through experience often lasts longer than awareness gained through advice. Jesus also spoke about patience expressed through trust. Waiting was not passive. It involved staying engaged without forcing outcome. The parable suggests that patience is active presence. It holds space until clarity emerges naturally. Impatience seeks control. Patience allows formation. Some stories addressed simplicity. Complex solutions were unnecessary. What was required was often small and already available. The parable does not reject effort. It invites focus. Sometimes clarity arrives not by adding more, but by removing excess. Simplicity restores attention to what matters. As Jesus continued, his voice remained calm. He did not increase intensity to maintain engagement. He trusted familiarity. He trusted repetition. He trusted that meaning, when allowed to circulate freely, would shape understanding quietly. The parables continue to function as companions rather than instructions. They do not command. They remain present. They return when needed without insisting on notice. And through this steady companionship, awareness deepens further. Focus steadies. Direction clarifies. Not through urgency, not through force, but through presence that remains.
and as the reflections continued,
Jesus often spoke about the quiet power of consistency. Not intensity that fades quickly, but steady presence maintained over time. The parables suggest that what remains unchanged often shapes more than what appears dramatic. One story describes small actions repeated faithfully. Each instance felt insignificant. Nothing about the moment suggested lasting impact. Yet over time, those repeated choices created a stable foundation. The parable does not glorify smallness. It honors persistence. What is repeated gently often carries greater influence than what happens rarely. Another parable focused on awareness that sharpened gradually. Early understanding was incomplete. Missteps occurred. Yet attention remained. The story affirms growth that includes adjustment. Learning is rarely linear. Clarity develops as perception matures. Jesus also spoke about peace that remained despite uncertainty. Outcomes were unclear. Plans were unconfirmed. Yet inner steadiness continued. The parable does not promise resolution. It describes alignment. Peace grows when intention and action remain aligned, even when result is unknown. Some stories addressed influence that appeared ordinary. No authority was exercised, no instruction was imposed, yet presence alone reshaped others quietly. The parable highlights how example influences more deeply than explanation. What is lived consistently often teaches without words. As Jesus continued teaching, he did not rush towards summary. He trusted accumulation. He allowed themes to return from different angles. Repetition softened resistance. Familiarity deepened understanding. The parables remain effective because they feel safe to stay with. They do not disrupt rest. They do not demand focus. They accompany routine with gentle clarity. And through this steady presence, attention settles further. Perception refines. Direction steadies. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but steadily.
and as the teaching carried on,
Jesus continued to point toward the quiet influence of inward posture. Not what people claimed outwardly, but what they carried internally shaped their direction. The parables suggest that life is often guided less by spoken intention and more by unspoken priority. What lives beneath the surface eventually steers behavior. One story described humility revealed through listening, not speaking first, not defending quickly, simply remaining open long enough to understand. The parable does not discourage voice. It honors receptivity. Listening deeply often prevents unnecessary conflict before it begins. Another parable focused on trust built slowly rather than assumed. Confidence did not arrive instantly. It formed through repeated reliability. The story does not portray trust as feeling. It reveals trust as experience. Consistency over time creates security that words alone cannot supply. Jesus also spoke about responsibility carried without recognition. Effort remains steady even when unnoticed. The parable does not promise visibility. It affirms integrity. Doing what is right without expecting acknowledgement shapes character quietly. Integrity practiced in private often supports far more than success displayed publicly. Some stories addressed clarity that arrived after simplification. Complication had obscured understanding. Once excess was removed, meaning became clear. The parable suggests that many problems persist not because solutions are absent, but because attention is divided. Simplicity restores focus to what truly matters. As Jesus continued speaking, his tone remained consistent. He did not escalate emotion. He trusted the steady return of familiar ideas. He allowed insight to surface without pressure. The parables continue to work because they feel like companions. They do not interrupt life. They travel alongside it. They resurface gently during still moments and quiet routines. And through this ongoing presence, awareness continues to refine. Focus steadies. Perspective widens. Direction clarifies. Not abruptly, not dramatically, but steadily.
And as the reflections carried forward,
Jesus continued to speak about how direction is shaped long before it is noticed. Rarely through a single choice, more often through repeated posture. The parables draw attention to what people return to again and again. What is revisited consistently eventually becomes central. One story described adjustment that happened quietly. No announcement marked it, no confession accompanied it. Attention simply shifted. The parable does not require drama. It affirms awareness. Change that begins inwardly often reshapes outward life without resistance. Gentle correction can be more lasting than forceful intervention. Another parable focused on responsibility accepted without calculation. Someone acted not because outcome was guaranteed, but because care was appropriate. The story does not elevate risk. It honors alignment. When intention and action match, results matter less than faithfulness. Direction remains steady even when outcome is uncertain. Jesus also spoke about restraint that preserved understanding. Words were available, reaction was possible, yet silence was chosen. The parable does not praise silence as avoidance, it reveals wisdom. Not every moment requires response. Some require space for clarity to form. Some stories addressed value that revealed itself slowly. At first, it appeared unremarkable. Only later, through experience, did its importance become clear. The parable suggests that discernment improves with patience. Rushed evaluation often misses depth. Time refines attention. As Jesus continued teaching, the rhythm never shifted dramatically. He remained steady. He trusted familiarity. He trusted repetition. He trusted that these ideas, returned to gently, would settle where needed. The parables remain effective because they do not exhaust the listener. They drift quietly through ordinary moments. They resurface without demand. They offer perspective without urgency. And through this continued presence, awareness deepens further. Expectation softens. Judgment relaxes. Direction stabilizes. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but steadily. And as the stories continued to unfold, Jesus often spoke about the quiet difference between accumulation and depth. Many collect experiences, many gather knowledge, many accumulate activity. The parables gently ask whether accumulation is producing depth or merely adding weight. Depth forms when experience is allowed to shape awareness, not just fill time. One story described someone who mistook abundance for stability. Everything needed seemed present. Resources were sufficient. Plans were secure. Yet awareness had narrowed. The parable does not criticize provision. It reveals dependency. When security rests only on what is visible, clarity becomes fragile. Depth requires attention beyond what can be counted. Another parable focused on alignment, maintained through restraint. Opportunities appeared frequently. Not all were beneficial. The story does not condemn opportunity. It honors discernment. Choosing what not to pursue often preserves energy for what truly matters. Direction is protected by limits chosen wisely. Jesus also spoke about repetition that gradually shapes identity. What is practiced daily becomes familiar. What is familiar feels natural. The parable highlights how habit quietly influences character. Identity is often revealed not in moments of decision, but in patterns of behavior. Awareness allows habit to be shaped intentionally. Some stories addressed clarity that emerged through reflection. Looking back revealed meaning that was not visible moving forward. The parable does not elevate hindsight, it affirms patience. Understanding often arrives after distance provides perspective. Reflection transforms memory into insight. As Jesus continued teaching, he did not introduce complexity. He returned to essentials: attention, direction, awareness, consistency. Each theme revisited with gentle variation. Repetition did not weaken meaning, it refined it. The parables continue accompanying life because they do not compete for focus. They remain near. They surface quietly during ordinary moments. They invite awareness without demand. And through this steady companionship, perception continues to mature. Focus steadies. Direction clarifies. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but steadily. And as the parables continued, Jesus returned again to the quiet tension between urgency and importance. Many things demand immediate attention. They feel pressing, they feel loud, they feel unavoidable. Yet the parables invite the listener to notice how urgency often competes with what matters most. Importance is rarely urgent. It waits patiently for attention to turn toward it. One story described someone who responded quickly but without reflection. Action was taken immediately. Nothing appeared wrong. Yet direction shifted subtly. The parable does not condemn decisiveness. It reveals what decisiveness requires. Speed without awareness often mistakes motion for progress. Slowing down can protect clarity. Another parable focused on discernment formed through listening. Not listening to noise, but listening beneath it. The story does not portray listening as passive. It shows listening as deliberate attention. Understanding deepens when space is created for what is quieter. Noise distracts. Silence refines. Jesus also spoke about trust that remained steady when circumstances fluctuated. Nothing stayed consistent externally, yet alignment remained. The parable does not promise stability, it affirms grounding. When purpose is clear, change does not destabilize direction. Clarity anchors movement. Some stories addressed correction that came through humility. Someone recognized limitation without resistance. Adjustment followed naturally. The parable honors teachability. Growth continues when certainty softens. Learning persists when openness remains. As Jesus continued teaching, he did not press for response. He trusted the listener. He trusted repetition. He trusted that meaning, revisited gently, would shape awareness more deeply than urgency ever could. The parables remain effective because they move at a human pace. They do not rush insight. They allow understanding to arrive gradually. They stay close to ordinary life. And through this ongoing presence, attention settles further. Perspective matures. Direction stabilizes. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but steadily.
And as the teaching continued without interruption,
Jesus returned again to the quiet difference between visibility and faithfulness. Many actions are performed to be seen. Others are done with no audience at all. The parables do not condemn visibility. They reveal what visibility cannot measure. What is done in obscurity often forms character more deeply than what is done before others. One story described effort that appeared unnoticed. Care was given. Responsibility was honored. No recognition followed. Yet the parable affirms that unseen faithfulness still carries weight. What is practiced consistently shapes the inner life, even when no affirmation arrives. Another parable focused on perception that shifted with proximity. From a distance, judgment felt easy. Up close, complexity appeared. The story does not reject discernment, it refines it. Understanding deepens when attention moves closer. Distance simplifies. Presence clarifies. Jesus also spoke about readiness that developed quietly. Nothing urgent prompted it. No crisis forced preparation. Awareness was simply maintained during ordinary moments. The parable suggests that preparation practiced calmly prevents panic later. Readiness grows long before it is needed. Some stories addressed priority revealed by return. Where attention returned, naturally revealed what truly mattered. Not what was claimed, but what was revisited. The parable does not shame distraction, it clarifies devotion. What attention repeatedly returns to, eventually shapes direction. As Jesus continued speaking, his cadence remained unchanged. He did not heighten emotion, he did not summarize prematurely. He trusted continuity. He trusted that meaning, allowed to remain steady, would deepen naturally. The parables continue functioning as companions rather than instructions. They walk alongside routine. They remain during repetition. They surface gently without demand. And through this continued presence, awareness becomes steadier. Focus sharpens quietly. Direction stabilizes. Not through urgency, not through force, but through presence that remains.
and as the reflections continued,
Jesus often invited attention to the subtle difference between knowing something and living as though it were true. Knowledge can exist without influence. Understanding can remain distant if it is not allowed to shape response. The parables do not criticize knowledge, they reveal what knowledge needs in order to become wisdom. Wisdom emerges when awareness moves from thought into practice. One story describes someone who recognized truth quickly but hesitated to respond fully. Agreement came easily. Commitment followed slowly. The parable does not accuse hesitation. It shows its cost. What is delayed repeatedly loses momentum. Urgency fades when action is postponed too long. Another parable focused on trust extended quietly. Someone remained reliable without being monitored. No pressure enforced behavior. Integrity guided choice. The story honors self-direction. Character revealed in unobserved moments often sustains direction more than rules ever could. Jesus also spoke about awareness that adjusted expectation. Something anticipated eagerly did not arrive as imagined. At first, disappointment followed. Later, understanding formed. The parable affirms flexibility. Meaning is not lost when expectation changes. It often deepens. Some stories addressed correction, received through consequence. Nothing dramatic announced the lesson. Experience itself became teacher. The parable does not glorify difficulty, it acknowledges learning. Insight gained through experience often settles more deeply than instruction given beforehand. As Jesus continued teaching, he did not force transformation. He trusted reflection. He trusted time. He trusted that these stories, heard gently and repeatedly, would find their place naturally. The parables remain effective because they respect the listener. They do not pressure decision. They allow awareness to grow quietly. They return during stillness and routine. And through this patient presence, perspective continues to mature. Certainty softens. Discernment strengthens. Direction clarifies. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but steadily. And as the stories continued without pause, Jesus gently returned to the question of fruit. Not immediate result, not visible success, but what remains after time has passed. The parables suggest that fruit is not produced by pressure. It grows through alignment sustained quietly. One story described effort that looked identical from the outside. Actions matched, words sounded similar, yet outcomes differed. The parable does not measure effort alone, it examines source. What feeds an action matters as much as the action itself. When motivation is shallow, results fade. When purpose is rooted, growth continues. Another parable focused on pruning, not punishment, not loss for its own sake. Removal created space, energy redirected. The story does not portray pruning as deprivation. It reveals refinement. Letting go of what drains attention strengthens what remains. Clarity often arrives after unnecessary weight is removed. Jesus also spoke about patience, expressed through trust in process. Nothing happened immediately. Days passed quietly. The parable does not promise speed, it affirms endurance. Lasting growth respects seasons. Forcing outcomes early often weakens what could have matured. Some stories addressed responsibility that continued after initial reward faded. Early satisfaction did not sustain commitment. What followed was choice. The parable honors perseverance. Faithfulness that continues after excitement fades reveals depth. What lasts beyond novelty often holds greatest value. As Jesus continued speaking, his voice remained steady. He did not intensify expectation. He trusted repetition. He trusted that meaning, circling gently, would settle into awareness. The parables continue shaping perception because they do not insist on conclusion. They revisit ordinary moments. They refine understanding slowly. They accompany life quietly. And through this continued presence, attention becomes more settled. Perspective matures, direction strengthens. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but steadily.
And as the quiet reflection continued,
Jesus returned again to the difference between outcome and formation. People often focus on results. They measure progress by what is visible. The parables gently redirect attention to what is being formed within, what is becoming steady, what is being shaped quietly through repeated response. One story described patience that outlasted disappointment. Expectation had been high. Time passed without fulfillment. The parable does not deny disappointment. It reframes endurance. Remaining faithful when expectation is unmet reveals trust that runs deeper than outcome. Formation continues even when results are delayed. Another parable focused on reliability that remained unnoticed. Commitments were kept without reminder. Responsibilities were honored without recognition. The story honors integrity that operates independently of reward. Character formed in obscurity often sustains life when recognition fades. Jesus also spoke about awareness that redirected energy. Attention was scattered across many concerns. Nothing felt wrong individually, yet clarity weakened. The parable suggests that focus is regained not by doing more, but by doing less with greater intention. Refinement sharpens awareness. Some stories addressed gratitude that restored perspective. Expectation had distorted appreciation. Comparison had weakened joy. The parable widens vision. What is received freely is better held with gratitude than measured against others. Gratitude steadies the heart where comparison unsettles it. As Jesus continued teaching, he did not seek resolution. He allowed the stories to circle gently. The same ideas returned from new angles. Formation over outcome. Awareness over urgency. Presence over pressure. The parables remain effective because they do not compete for attention. They remain near. They surface during repetition. They settle during stillness. And through this continued presence, attention becomes calmer, understanding deepens, direction becomes more secure. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but steadily.
and as the teaching carried on,
Jesus gently returned to the idea of direction revealed through consistency, not through isolated moments, but through what is sustained. The parables suggest that life is not shaped by occasional inspiration. It is shaped by what is practiced when nothing demands attention. One story described discipline that appeared unnecessary to others. Effort was applied without visible reward. The choice seemed excessive. Yet over time, its value became clear. The parable does not glorify rigidity. It honors intentionality. What is tended regularly remains resilient when conditions change. Another parable focused on attentiveness that prevented regret. Someone noticed subtle warning signs. Nothing urgent forced response. Yet awareness prompted adjustment. The story affirms perception. Recognizing drift early allows correction without loss. Awareness acts before consequence hardens. Jesus also spoke about trust that remains steady during uncertainty. Nothing promised success, nothing guaranteed ease. yet direction was maintained. The parable does not celebrate risk, it honors commitment. Faithfulness is not fueled by assurance of outcome, but by clarity of purpose. Some stories addressed simplification that restored clarity. Complexity had accumulated gradually, choices multiplied, focus blurred. The parable suggests that clarity often returns when attention narrows intentionally. Removing excess restores direction. As Jesus continued speaking, he did not vary cadence. He trusted rhythm. He trusted familiarity. He trusted that meaning, revisited calmly, would shape awareness deeply. The parables continue their work because they do not interrupt life. They accompany it. They surface quietly during routine moments. They refine perspective without urgency. And through this steady companionship, attention settles further. Perspective matures. Direction strengthens. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but steadily.
And as the teaching neared its close,
Jesus did not attempt to summarize every story. He did not gather conclusions into a single statement. Instead, he allowed the meaning to rest. The parables had already done their work. They had returned again and again to the same quiet themes: attention, direction, consistency, trust. Not as demands, but as invitations. Many of the stories were never meant to be remembered word for word. They were meant to be recognized in daily moments, recognized in ordinary decisions, recognized quietly when no one else was present. Meaning was not confined to the telling. It continued afterward. Jesus trusted this process. He trusted that awareness, once stirred gently, would continue working. That understanding, once planted, would grow at its own pace. No urgency was required. No pressure was applied. The parables did not ask listeners to do more. They asked them to notice more, to slow just enough to recognize direction, to pause just long enough to choose attentiveness over reaction. And in that space, something steady formed. Not certainty, not answers, but clarity that remained even when answers were incomplete. The kind of clarity that does not rush, the kind that lasts. These stories were never about perfection. They were about presence, remaining aware when distraction is easier, remaining aligned when drifting is natural, remaining steady when outcomes are unclear. And so, as the teaching settled, nothing dramatic followed, no final demand, no urgent call, only the quiet understanding that meaning continues where attention remains.
and as the stories lingered,
They began to feel less like teachings and more like companions. They did not stand apart from life, they moved within it, returning quietly during simple moments, resurfacing during stillness, appearing when the pace slowed. Jesus did not ask listeners to hold every detail. He trusted what would remain. Not the wording, but the awareness behind it. Not the story itself, but the way it reshaped perception. The parables were never meant to overwhelm memory. They were meant to soften attention. Much of what was shared could only be understood over time, not because it was hidden, but because meaning deepens as life unfolds. What feels unclear now often becomes evident later. The stories were patient because they were meant to grow alongside experience. Jesus trusted that people would encounter these truths again, in moments of uncertainty, in moments of rest, in moments when direction mattered. The parables were not temporary insights, they were seeds, and seeds do not demand attention. They remain quietly, working beneath the surface. No pressure, no urgency. Growth happens when conditions are right. These stories were never about control. They were about alignment, about returning gently to what matters, about choosing awareness over assumption, about allowing direction to form naturally through consistency rather than force. And so, the teaching did not end with instruction. It ended with space. Space to notice, space to reflect, space to remain present, because presence itself was always the invitation.
And as the reflections began to quiet,
The stories no longer asked for attention. They simply remained, not as lessons to be reviewed, but as understanding already absorbed. The work they were meant to do had been done gently, without effort. Jesus never required immediate agreement. He did not measure response by outward action alone. He trusted that awareness, once awakened, would continue its work long after the words ended. Truth did not need to be forced. It needed time. The parables respected silence. They allowed space for thought to slow and for meaning to rest. Nothing further was required. No response needed to be formed. Simply remaining present was enough. Much of what was heard would return unexpectedly, not as memory, but as recognition. In moments of stillness, in moments of choice, in moments where direction quietly mattered. That was always their purpose. Jesus understood that lasting change rarely begins loudly. It begins quietly, inwardly, where no audience is present. Awareness forms there. Clarity takes shape there. And so the stories did not end with resolution. They ended with release, an open hand, a quiet breath, a gentle sense of orientation. Nothing urgent, nothing unfinished. What needed to remain would remain. What could be let go would fade naturally. The teaching trusted that process, and in that trust, the moment began to settle into rest.
and as the final moments arrived,
Nothing new needed to be said. The stories had already settled where they were meant to rest, not as instructions to remember, but as quiet understanding that remains without effort. Jesus did not seek conclusion. He trusted continuation, that what had been heard would carry forward naturally into ordinary moments and quiet choices. The parables were never meant to end sharply. They were meant to fade gently into awareness. Nothing more is required now. No response needs to be formed. No resolution needs to be reached. Simply remaining present is enough. The mind can rest. Attention can soften. What matters will remain without strain. What does not will release itself naturally. This was always the intention, not urgency, not pressure, not demand. Only clarity that settles slowly and stays. And so, the teaching comes to rest, not as an ending, but as a gentle pause, a quiet space where understanding continues without effort. Nothing is missing. Nothing is unfinished. There is only stillness now.
and even after the words had faded,
The stillness remained. Not empty, not silent, but settled. This was always part of the teaching, not what was spoken, but what remained after speech was no longer needed. Understanding does not always arrive in clear sentences. Sometimes it arrives as orientation, a quiet sense of where one stands, a gentle awareness of what feels aligned and what does not. Jesus trusted this kind of understanding. He did not insist that meaning be held tightly. He allowed it to rest lightly, to remain present without effort. The parables were never meant to demand attention forever. They were meant to leave something behind, a softened awareness, a calmer posture, a steadier direction. Nothing further needs to be resolved. The mind does not need to search for conclusions. What matters will surface naturally when it is needed. That is how these stories work. They return quietly, during simple moments, during still evenings, during ordinary decisions. They do not announce themselves. They recognize you when you recognize them. And so this space remains open, not unfinished, but complete enough to rest within. And as the moment continues to settle, there is no need to hold on to anything. Nothing needs to be replayed, nothing needs to be remembered in a precise way. What matters has already found its place. Understanding does not always remain as words. Often it becomes atmosphere, a way of being present without effort, a sense of steadiness that does not need explanation. This is the kind of understanding Jesus trusted. The stories have finished speaking, but their presence continues, not as instruction, not as demand, as quiet orientation, as something that stays without asking to be noticed. Now the mind can release attention. Thoughts can slow without being pushed away. Awareness can rest without direction. There is nothing left to follow, nothing left to resolve. This space is enough. Breath becomes easier. Stillness feels natural. Time no longer needs to be measured. And so the teaching does not conclude with a line or a signal. It simply dissolves into rest, into quiet, into a pause that does not need to end. Nothing more is required. Nothing has been missed. There is only calm now, only stillness, only rest.